I'm here talking with Theresa Werba, formerly Teresa Rodriguez. She is a poet and author hailing from the East Coast. Is it Pennsylvania?
In Pennsylvania, yeah.
So she is the author of Jesus and Eros, Sonnets, Poems, and Songs, Longer Thoughts, and Sonnets, a collection of 65 sonnets published by Shanti Arts. And she has also published a new book, which she'll be talking about very shortly. Her work has appeared in many journals and publications. Teresa is also a singer. Her album Lullabies, Traditional American and International Songs, is available to listen to on Spotify. There are also videos of her singing Bach and Handel on YouTube, which I have a link to in the description. Now, Teresa, welcome. It's great to have you on.
Thank you, Andrew, very much.
Now, Teresa, were you primarily a classical singer?
I was, yeah. I always had an interest in folk music of a particular bent. I enjoy and have enjoyed Anglo-Celtic ballads. I love that sort of thing. And I went in that direction a lot as well. Songs in the classical repertoire.
Folk music has that kind of historical element, right? I mean, I think of like Vaughan Williams and Bartok too, like they often added folk elements into their music. So there's that kind of give and take between the two genres.
Yeah.
I do think it's so interesting you bridge the world of poetry and classical singing. And I was wondering which came first. Were you a singer first and then a poet, or was it the other way around?
Well, I was thinking about this question. I was a singer first. Well, I was a musician first because I played piano when I was younger. And then it might have been a simultaneous growing, but my main track was always singing. And I did write. And I began to think about that because I know a lot of poets would attribute their growth as a poet or their introduction to poetry from reading other poets. And I have to say that that really wasn't my case. It was my singing poetry and singing poetry in the form of songs, classical music, hymns, and other things like that. And the poetry in that, the musicality of it, the combination of the words and the music has always informed how I write and what I hear when I'm writing.
You know, it's funny because my most recent piece published in the Epic Times happens to be about opera librettists, and I focused on Metastasio. He's probably the most popular librettist of all time. I mean, he's been adapted, or at least was adapted many times in the 18th and 19th centuries. His primary occupation was as a poet. He was like the court poet of the Viennese imperial family. He would add all these little poetic flourishes into the music. He wouldn't let the opera singers, when they were embellishing a cadence, they have to sing in ahs and ohs. He would omit certain vowels from the libretto. Like they couldn't sing it like I's or E's because they don't carry as well. And just all these little interactions between the words and the music. And so we're both thinking about that.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, it's also the case that you could draw analogies from poetry to your painting, for example, like ekphrastic poetry. You can get something out of poetry, you can learn, you can become a better poet by studying the other genres and the other forms as well, at least indirectly. But would you argue that there are more analogies between music and poetry, perhaps, than
For
other
me,
forms?
I want it to sound beautiful. I mean, I guess that's the end product is that it sounds beautiful, or at least I hope it does. I'm trying to create beauty through the sound. The thought is good too. I'm not saying that that's not important, but I really do, I think, approach it with a high degree of auditory, AURAL, because when I was singing regularly, the act of singing, it's a physical kinesthetic thing. And I think when you're reciting poetry that way in your songs and whatever it is you're singing, I mean, how can that not affect you if you're already a person with a literary bent or a creative bent to writing at all? How can it not affect what the product is that you end up with?
So I think it's interesting that you also bridge this divide. You also bridge another divide, and that is the divide within poetry itself, the free verse formalist divide, which is, a very controversial thing these days. Obviously, I fall in the formalist circle. Would you say you approach both equally, or does one have more of that musical lyricism than another?
When I was younger, I didn't even know there was a divide. I just wrote what I found the vehicle through which I could write, whatever it was I was feeling in my heart or thinking about, or a combination. And I didn't know that there was this political divide or cultural divide between formal poetry and free verse. I just always wrote both. And I still do, because I think there are some times where it just seems to make sense to use free verse. I would say that my default has been, for at least the last 20 some odd years, has been formal poetry. And I also enjoy the structure and the challenge and the beauty of the form.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that that free verse doesn't have beauties. It does in some sense, but I'll be honest with you, a lot of what I hear is it's not as disciplined as I would like to see.
The spontaneity aspect is really emphasized. And I think that's kind of misleading because, all good art is about revision, right? Walt Whitman revised Leaves of Grass, for decades. And I think that good free verse maybe gives an impression of spontaneity without really actually being spontaneous. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll be honest with you, when I have written the last few longer free verse poems that I've written were spontaneous and they were not crafted. I didn't actually go back and revise anything. It was a very subconscious sort of, here I'm going to express this, and it came out in that particular form. I don't think that works for me with formal poetry. I trip over myself when I'm writing, and I need to go back and revise it, and I revise it, and then I put it away for a while, and then I'll look at it and I'll go, why did I ever put that there, and have to fix it. So it involves a lot more.
I will say when I read your free verse, I think it's much more lyrical than most free verse that I read that's kind of focuses on much more monosyllabic diction.
To me, a lot of it is shock value. It seems like, let's put a bunch of words together that don't normally go together, and it's titillating maybe, but I want to hear more than that. And there are some that do approach deeper matters, but a lot of times also I find with some free verse, it's not anything that I can understand. It's very cryptic, maybe because it is throwing all these words together that don't normally go together and juxtaposing things. And I don't know what the point of it is. I'm saying, what are they trying to say? Maybe if I read it, it would be different because I'm hearing a lot of it. I personally go to poetry readings, and I may be the only one there that does a formal poem, but I feel I am as much a poet as anyone, and I do participate in these things, and I have gotten appreciation and, dare I say, respect. I'm grateful for that.
That's good. That's great. We could talk about your new book out. We could plug your new book.
Oh yes, I'd like to show you. It's going to come out. I think it comes out backwards, doesn't it?
No, I can see it. I can read it. Yeah.
Well, this is What Was and Is, formal poetry and free verse. What it is I didn't structure it according to type of poem. I structured it according to categories of things that have been important to me as a writer, a poet, what I've been writing about. The first section is called Writing is the Labor of the Mind, and each of the titles of the sections is a line from one of the poems. So I say here, I delve into the creative process, joys and frustrations, my experimentation with an initiation into sonnet forms such as Petrarchan and Spenserian. So I also have some, I don't know what you call them, sonnets, but whatever they are. And then the next section is All the Loves I've Loved and Known, a collection of poetry to people I have loved and lost, or whose love I never managed to obtain throughout my life, and the state of things as it has come to be. My mental world is overloaded. It explores various aspects of my own experience with neurodivergence, the hot word of the 2020s, including Asperger's syndrome, which is level 1 autism, anxiety, and bipolar disorder, which I had been diagnosed with, but I don't think that's my issue. But Pantheon is the next section. It's a collection of poems I've written to or about other people. Some were historical, some contemporary, some literary, and some personal. So I have, historical figures that I've admired, or literary characters that I've admired. Music's made through it reflects my aspects of my life as a singer and a musician. So there's musical references in there more so maybe than some of the other parts. Then the next section is the ebbs and flows of life are about pivotal experiences, mine particularly that I was adopted, and how I found both my biological parents. I mean, that's not a typical thing. The change that comes with age is that explores the challenges and vicissitudes of the aging process, which I have lots to say about. And the last section is called Ever Towards Uncertainty, where I try to come to terms with the great changes in my spiritual life over the last few years and where I am at right now, which is why it's called What Was and Is, partially because of where I'm at, my spiritual journey in the last number of years.
Now, this incorporates some of your previous works published through Shanty Arts, right? But you didn't go through Shanty Arts this time.
Not this time. I mean, it was really a friendly parting of the ways because my daughter had basically designed this cover that I liked, and they wanted a certain cover and I wanted a certain cover. And so I self-published this one.
I'm curious as to your thoughts about the differences, your perceptions on the differences between, like, quote, legitimate publishing and self-publishing these days. I've heard it said that that's much less of an important distinction now than it ever was in the past. Given the power of Amazon KDP and stuff, your ability to do things on a more sophisticated level as an individual. But then there is the problem of you're just one person. How do you distribute everything? There's the distribution aspect and the marketing aspect, which traditional publishing houses would do. But, with the age of social media, you have to do that too. Even if you get traditionally published, you still have to do the Twitter stuff. So I was just curious about, given your experience in both worlds, what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, well, first of all, getting published by a publisher is hard to do, especially if you're a poet. I mean, it's so subjective if a particular editor happens to like you. And I'm talking about getting published in an online journal or a print journal. It's the same thing. If they happen to like you, you could really suck. But if they happen to like you, you're going to get published. And of course, what suck is depends on your opinion of what's good and what's not good, or what is valuable poetry versus not valuable poetry. It's an iffy thing to get published at all. So my opinion is I would rather have something in my hand that I did than not. And so I highly recommend self-publishing. The beauty of it is it's not just KDP. There's another publishing venue, I guess you call it Amazon Spark, which also a lot of the smaller publishers use Amazon Spark publish to actually print their books.
Ingram Spark, is it?
And they have connections with libraries and stuff. I would say that's the only thing that's harder is how do you get what you're doing to the librarians who buy a lot. So that's a challenge. But like you said, in this day and age, you have to have an internet presence. You have to have a following. Those are the people that may end up really liking your poetry. So therefore, I would say get a website, get a blog, get Instagram, get Twitter or X, get something and put your poems out after you publish it. And then I would not hold back with trying to get published anywhere you possibly can, even if it's not what you would consider the venue that you would normally go through, or they only publish free verse. Well, you'd be surprised. I mean, I've been published in a lot of these things that I never thought they would be interested, and they were.
Just got to put yourself out there. I was looking at Ingram Spark, and then I was looking into the issue of, how do you get that stuff distributed? And the answer that most people seem to say, if you're not a well-known person, is you kind of just have to pound the pavement and go to these individual places. And your best shot is getting in independent bookstores. Well, there's not very many independent bookstores left. There's 2,000 in America, and that might have been a few years ago. But they're just shrinking all the time. They can't compete with Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, what I've also done is there's an app called Canva, Canva, and what I've done, especially because I write a lot of sonnets or have written a lot of sonnets, they fit in the little box that's provided for you to make, let's just say, an Instagram post or a Twitter post. It actually will give you the option, do you want to make an Instagram post? And I say yes. Well, then I copy and paste my poem into it, put my at the Sonnet Queen at the bottom, whatever, and then that becomes my little thing that I can put up on Instagram, and then the people that have seen me will see a poem that I wrote. So it's a way to do it, and I'd rather them be out there than not out there. So I haven't done it in a while, but I used to do it more frequently.
I have a Canva Pro account myself, and I am using it to produce the slides for this podcast.
Oh, cool. That's so cool.
So, and I use it to design my book covers and stuff too. I'll use it for everything. It's so useful.
I have been using Canva a lot now too. We did use it for this book,
I wanted to talk about some of your influences.
Well, like I said, when I started writing poetry, it was through the music that I sang. So I sang a lot of Anglo-Celtic ballads, Elizabethan lute songs, and a lot of them are actually very good poetry, obviously formal poetry. I'll give you, the example of Thomas Morley, who wrote a lot. He was in 1557 to 1602. John Dowland, 1563 to 1626. Thomas Campion, 1567 to 1620. That whole time was so beautiful and so rich and so fertile and just exploding with these beautiful, beautiful songs, accessible songs, singable songs. You could read them as poems if you wanted to, but I highly suggest exposing yourself to this whole genre. It's so beautiful, and it's in English. Obviously, you can hear it. The language hasn't changed all that much. You can get what they're saying. I would say the kinesthetic aspect of singing the poetry really has informed how I write poetry. So I would recommend singing poetry. How do you do that? You can either start with Anglo-Celtic ballads. There's the John Jacob Niles ballad book, even just hymns if you're in that direction spiritually, Wesleyan hymns, John Newton, beautiful, beautiful poetry. And they're written to be sung by the average person. So they're not highly technically difficult or anything, but you get the poetry into you by any of these means. If you're interested in actual singers, one of my teachers back in the 80s was one of the top early music singers of our last 50 years, whatever, Julianne Baird. And she has an album, The English Lute Song. I think the title is Greensleeves. Andrea Scholl is a countertenor who sings lute songs, English folk songs, and lute songs. Drew Minter, also another really excellent countertenor. Emma Kirkby was also really hot back in the day. She has an album called The Lady Music, Elizabethan Songs. These are just some ideas. You could get those on Spotify or whatever you use, just to kind of immerse yourself into it. And I think that goes a long way. And I know maybe politically some people don't like Joan Baez, but I loved her, especially her early work in the 60s was so beautiful. And she sang all these Anglo-Celtic ballads, and they just opened them up for people that would have never had any exposure to them. So this is my suggestion.
That's a very good angle. Popular songs are, of course, the hip hop and stuff like that is the primary way that most people are exposed to poetry. But being a formalist classical poet, I think what you're talking about is probably a better suggestion.
Modern poetry, it doesn't have that lyrical element or the musical element to it. It doesn't, half of them don't even have actual melodies. There's something rhythmic about it, maybe.
I did another tutorial video where I was talking about writing beautiful poetry. And I was talking about, like, certain words are perceived to have a more beautiful quality than other words. As far as talking about lyrical diction, or maybe we could get into this, within the specific context of some of your own poems if you want to read them. Any historical poets you want to share any of their work?
Okay, sure. I'd love to. I have a beautiful poem that reminds me a lot of my head sometimes. This is What Lips My Lips Have Kissed and Where and Why by Edna St. Vincent Millay. Sorry. What lips my lips have kissed and where and why I have forgotten. And what arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply. And in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. Thus, in the winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more.
You're really good at reciting poetry. I think you might be the best reciter that I've had on here.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to mention that as well. I don't know what poetry open mics are available around the country, but we happen to have a lot of them around here. And there are online forums that you can try to search your way through. Go to them and stand up and recite your poems. For me, I think because I was a singer, it's easier for me to do this sort of thing. And I enjoy it so much. I love every word. I love to caress the word. I love to taste it. I love to touch it. I love the way it feels on my tongue and my lips. And I think that's a beautiful experience. Everybody should experience their own poetry unless you want to get up and read somebody else's poem. Plus, what it does is it exposes people. I think most of those poetry readings are free verse. So be different. Be the one to go there and share something other than that, and say, hey, this can be done in a modern context. Yes, this isn't just some old-fashioned, outdated thing. This is vibrant, contemporary, new, fresh, and beautiful.
It would be nice if there were more open mics that were focused on classical poetry. Of course, I think we're just too few in number for that to happen, at least right now, unless it becomes more popular. I don't know if you know Daniel Kemper. He's like another SCP poet.
I've heard of him. I'm sure I've read his stuff.
He's published some essays on the website about how he does the same thing. I think he actually might manage them or something. He's like in academia too, and he's kind of like the classical poet mole in academia, where he's trying to encourage people to do that, and I'm not sure how successful he is so far. But a professor gave him a class to teach this summer that's just about formal poetry forms. Yeah, he talks about his experiences doing that. It reminds you that, poetry isn't just meant to be read silently.
It's supposed to be heard as well, I think.
But back to Millay. His poem is a masterclass in writing great sonnets. I don't know if I had read that one before. So wistful. very passionate too. One thing people often say about this kind of romantic style poetry is like, it's all about the passions, but then it's this very precise and controlled diction.
Very controlled. Yep.
She never overdoes it.
No, no, not at all. There's nothing sentimental about it.
And you have this very haunting feeling created by, the rain and the ghosts and the tap on the glass. It's just so brilliant. Now, has this particular poem, has this influenced your own style in any way? Did you come to this later on, or?
I don't think so. My poem, The Rise and Fall, they remind me of each other. If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind reading it.
Absolutely.
Okay, this is called The Rise of Fall. Her poem was a Petrarchan sonnet. So when she starts the sestet, a Petrarchan sonnet has an octet of 8 lines, then a sort of a second set of the sestet of 6 lines, and that is accompanied usually by a volta or a turn. In hers, she has that word thus, and therefore then it shifts into the sestet. And mine, this one also, I didn't even try to do that, but I also have a volta in the word but. The Rise of Fall. There were such pretty flowers in the spring, the fragrant colors of a verdant time, such fresh potentiality, sublime in all the loveliness that they did bring. Then summer issued forth a deep wellspring, maturely ripening, where vines would climb and trees begin to bulge. This is the prime of life, when growth will dance and sway and sing. But autumn is the time of now. I stand amid the harvests and the fruit. The change between the then and now leaves me jaded. I barely have the bearings to withstand this person of today. Indeed, how strange, how much the beauty of the past has faded.
A lot of rich imagery there. Love the diction of the wellspring and the ripening and the harvests. Vivid pictures of the changing seasons and the stages of life as well. Then you have a good mix of concrete and abstract diction there. Some people say, like, you should only use concrete words. I think that's just too much. You're just leaving out so much of the language if you're not using any more, of our Latin heritage.
Yeah, I am glad I wasn't taught those things.
I think that's like standard if you take an MFA.
Oh, I'm glad I didn't get an MFA. I'm so glad I didn't. I thought about it a lot, getting an MFA, but I didn't do that.
It just ruins you. But I especially love that the word verdant there. I think that words with V consonants are just so lyrical. There's something about the V that seems inherently more beautiful, almost than any other consonant.
It's interesting because in voice teaching, we use the V consonant to help bring nasal resonance, because what happens is it vibrates here. It doesn't mean that you're sounding nasal, but it helps to focus the sensation when you're singing correctly in a classical way. You do have resonance in what we call the mask, or this area, and the V consonant does that. Z does it, M does it, N does it.
On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have like the hard consonants like K or like X. I think X might be the worst. Just so harsh and hissing. I don't know if that's why the letter X is associated with things that we don't like, controversial things like pornos, rated X, or like triple X, or your ex-girlfriend.
Elon Musk would agree with you 100%.
In crafting lyrical poetry, it's all about the diction, and so certain words, certain letters, certain sounds, a certain class of language that are more lyrical than other sounds. Do you have any advice about that for anybody aspiring to be a lyric poet?
I don't think about that. Okay, when I know I'm going to write a formal poem, I really do map it out. I mean, I put it on the page with which rhymes are what, like A, and then skip a line and then write B, or whatever it is I'm doing, so that I have that framework, and then I'll work within that. But then what I like to do is, it sounds silly, but I really do create rhyme lists. And sometimes I do use, like, I think Rhymer is the website.
Is it Rhymer? Is it Rhyme Zone?
And I do use that. Sometimes I try to start with ones that come right out of me, because they might be more to the point of what I'm trying to write, those rhymes. And then if I'm really stuck, I'll go to Rhymer and I'll put them in. It may sound corny, but it works for me. And I've been able to find interesting rhymes that I didn't expect, or something that I forgot about. I think what I've done is listening for something unusual or something, a new way to use a word that's already out there, that's maybe more commonly used. I remember I have a poem, I almost read that one today, called Shaman of the Waves. And when I was writing it, I, at that point, was a pretty conservative Christian, and I used this word shaman. And I was like, am I in trouble? And I said, but that's who this person was to me. He was the shaman of the waves. He was one that could actually manipulate and control this thing that I was, which is this person full of waves and stuff like that. So, I mean, I think that's exciting when you can take a word and put it in a new way and do something a little daring.
You're saying, did somebody criticize you for that, for using that word shaman?
No, I criticized myself because I was like, am I going to get in trouble with God for using the word shaman? I was like, if somebody read it, would they think I'm some sort of sorcerer or something? I don't know what they would have thought, but
Okay.
I'm just grateful that I stuck with it. I mean, I do also have a poem that years ago I wrote, this a long time ago, the one called El Shaddai, which is the supreme breasted one. And that one, I wrote that when I was 22 years old. And I literally woke up at 5:30 in the morning one day until 7:30 and wrote this poem about the femininity of God. And I used, Jewish terms that are like ruach and chokmah and shekinah, which are feminine words in Hebrew, and how we could look at God that way. Oh, I was very much a conservative evangelical Christian at the time. And at least one person that meant a lot to me did criticize that poem. And I was like, well, I'm sorry. Now I'm really glad I wrote it. I'm very glad that it's out there. I just like to have it as something for people to think about. I think it's good to experiment, push it a little farther than out of your comfort zone a little bit.
When I read that El Shaddai poem, and I'd assumed that was a much more recent work.
No, I wrote that in 1984.
Wow, the year after I was born. Okay.
I do have another poem because we were talking about music. Would that be okay to read that one?
Yes, absolutely.
This one is called Oh When I Hear. And what I like about it is that I was able to sort of incorporate a lot of terminology or imagery with music. So if you've had a musical background, I think this one really would resonate with you. Oh, when I hear. Oh, when I hear the plaintive, painful sound of music played within a minor key, or modal scales in doleful reverie, suspensions and its dissonance abound. A juxtaposing light and dark around a center of discordant harmony, combined with the most weeping melody, is where a truth so sacred may be found. For it is in the ebbing resolution, when tensions ease and struggling is at rest, that one can find a consonant conclusion and peace from pain residing in the breast. For suffering can be of benefit if acquiescing music's made through it. So if I were to look at it myself and I say I love the alliteration of plaintive and painful, because you've got AI and AI, I didn't even, and I guess that's assonance, right?
Yeah, both.
But you've got the P's and the AI. I never really thought about it. So it comes out of musicality, I think. Even weeping melody, the EE vowel is very, and in W, the word weeping is such a great, if you sing it, weep, there's a lute song called Weep, O Mine Eyes. Weep, O Mine Eyes. It's just a great word. Anyway.
Oh, we were talking about the general connections between poetry and music, and this is much more overtly about the connection and the subject and the theme. I do like the middle about the juxtaposing light and dark, and then the weeping melody again is where truth so sacred may be found. And you've got the word juxtaposing, and then you've got a lot of juxtaposition in the poem itself. A lot of literary devices there.
I suppose it's just more, I tap into something that's not purely cerebral when I'm writing.
The muse has descended into you.
Well, whatever.
The metaphor of the muse I find is a useful one, even if it's not literally a goddess, in the classical Greek sense of that term.
Sometimes, I don't always find this, but I sometimes would say that some classical poetry is a little dry sometimes, or it lacks some kind of connection to the heart. And I did write one of my sonnets is about that. Why don't we connect them both? Because they're both valuable and important, and they are part of us. And I think maybe some classical poets are afraid to express I-centered poems or subjective. I'm like, oh, come on. This is just as much a part of what makes us human, and it is a beautiful thing to write about. And certainly the Elizabethans wrote plenty of it. But I definitely encourage searching out the sounds in your own poetry. Like, I would highly recommend reciting your poetry, even if you don't think you're that great with oratory or whatever. Do it anyway and take your time. That's one criticism that I definitely have had. I wish I could do something like this where I could offer a class in how to recite your poetry. Even the people that write the free verse and get up, they rush through it so fast, you don't even get a chance to relish the words. You don't get a chance to hear what they're trying to say because they've rushed through it. So I would really love to hear people take your time. And like I said, each word is a beautiful thing, not just to the ear, but to your mouth and your tongue. It's a great thing, those words.
We talked about, suggestions and advice. You've already offered a good amount of that. It seems like you found a good balance between, you do your work, you create the work, and then you spend a little bit of time trying to promote it, but not going overboard with that. The social media angle really can consume your life if you're so focused on that.
I mean, submitting to journals, nowadays, I'd say a lot of them use Submittable, which is you upload your poems into Submittable. Not only do I want my poems to be out there, but I also want people to read my little bio at the end, because the bio tells them where to find out more about what I'm doing. So I think writing a good bio is important, because there was somebody that I knew that had written a couple really nice volumes of poetry, but never put it in the bio. I'm like, well, how would anybody even know? He was just a kind of a self-effacing person. So I don't think you need to be self-effacing. I think you should let people know what you're about and not be afraid. I especially, like I said, getting out there into journals, even if they often say, look at it first and see if your poetry aligns with what we're doing. I said, yeah, you can do that, but then why not just submit it anyway? What's it going to hurt you to have them look at it? Maybe it'll strike something in them and they'll say, okay, this is different. On that note, there are a couple of Spindrift is a journal out of California, and I know James Tweedy was published in it. James Nicola is published in it. I've been published in it a few times, and they take free verse and formal poetry as well. Mezzo Cayman, I think it's pronounced Cayman or Caman. I don't know how you pronounce that. But anyway, it's formal poetry for women, which is kind of interesting and unusual. So that's out there. Of course, that's Society of Classical Poets. And then what I did on Twitter, I started following almost anything I could that had to do with publishing or online journals. And one thing leads to another. And then you see that somebody's got open submissions for something. So I'm like, okay, why not? And submit it in. Maybe make a nice cover letter that says something to the effect of, I know maybe this isn't, you don't normally publish formal poetry, but I'd like you to take a look. I'd be honored if you would take a look, something like that. Obsequious, maybe a little. I would be delighted if you would take the time to look at what I'm offering you. I try to be as polite as I possibly can.
So many aspects to master that you never think of if you're trying to pursue poetry as a vocation.
Speaking of which, I honestly think it's an avocation. I wouldn't ever, unless you're Maya Angelou, who gets it to be a famous poet. I highly doubt that anyone, no matter how good they are, is going to make it their so-called career. I think writing poetry in conjunction with other writing is wonderful and should be done. But I think the only way you're going to get yourself out there are the things that I've mentioned. Going to poetry readings, getting something published. And if you have to self-publish it, then figure out how to do that, because it's not that hard. I literally can do it in Microsoft Word and upload a Microsoft Word document that's a PDF to Amazon and have a book published. And, the cover, however, is a little more complicated, but like I said, Canva is very useful and very helpful. Or you may just have to get somebody to help you with the cover. But I would rather have a book in my hand that is actually something that I created than not have it. However, I do that. And the beauty of using the online publishing is that, let's just say you do have a mistake. For instance, I spelled Lynette Esposito from north of Oxford. I spelled her name wrong. Well, of course, the next set of books does not have that mistake. It's a beautiful thing. You can change what you're doing at any time. You can make small edits that are only maybe known to you, but isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, that's great. That's one of my favorite things too. Well, what does the future hold for you, Teresa? Can we expect any more volumes?
Well, what I am working on is a cookbook. I have all this stuff that I made this like thing a few years ago for my kids, and then I'm doing it through Canva, and I am have pictures of my recipes and whatnot. So that's just a thing I'm doing for mainly for the kids, but I want to try to get it done for Christmas. I have another book that I've finished. I have a couple things that I still need to wrap up about it, but it's a book called Finally Autistic: Finding My Autism Diagnosis as a 50-year-old or as a middle-aged woman. I think that's the subtitle. It's really probably geared for people who have some sort of involvement with neurodivergence or on the autism spectrum or whatever you want to call it, because it's just my story. I did not know that I had autism until I was in my mid 50s. And so I had been diagnosed as bipolar before that, since my early 20s and or mid 20s. And I'm very grateful that all the things that had happened in my life make a whole lot more sense now that I understand myself better with the autism diagnosis. It's actually appearing in a autism conference in November, and then I should be able to be a speaker there the following year, a group out of in here in Pennsylvania. So people seem to respond to that more than they respond to my poetry, which is kind of
Yeah, right. I mean, it's just anything in prose is just going to get more attention.
I just think that the concept of neurodivergence is very hot right now. It's very, I wrote it just to share my story because I figured maybe somebody out there would find it interesting. Like, how did you go your whole life not knowing? And how did you get diagnosed? What did you do? And I had a lot of problems as a child that I fortunately had my evaluations and report cards from when I was a preschooler, very well written, detailed chronicles of my problems that I had as a child that were not explainable by anything else now that I know. You go back on it and you could see, okay, I had this, I did this, I had a meltdown, I did this. When I was in school, I always had behavioral problems with self-control, and I was always the most talkative kid in the class. I was always the one that called out the answers. And, I had trouble with some social things. Singing was, for me, the bridge to having some sort of a normal life, because I was able to, what they call masking in autism parlance, which is you learn how to, quote unquote, act socially acceptable, and women tend to do it more successfully than men on the spectrum. So I managed to figure out how to mask it in order to get on a stage and perform, so I could get up there and do this. And that was successful for me because I could get up and do it for an hour and then leave. So it was different than holding a normal job. So it worked out very well for me for a long time to perform.
Well, you have your fingers in many pies here with your publications. You have some online handles and, a website to share?
Yes, I do. My website is Theresa Werba, same as my name, TheresaWerb as in boy a.com. I also am on Instagram and X, Twitter, and Threads at the Sonnet Queen. Somebody once called me that. I just thought it was a nice little handle. So it's just at the Sonnet Queen.
So you're the original Sonic Queen, so if anybody else steals that, we'll have to...
But as far as the internet, I think so.
Okay, well, good. Yeah, I've looked at your website. Your website is very professionally done. Like, it looks fantastic.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I use Wix. That's what I did. I used Wix. I do pay for the higher level of Wix because I think there's a free level that isn't as, you don't get as much stuff out of it. But so I pay for the higher level one. And then they have these samples, and you just kind of input your own stuff and change it around, which is what I did. I made it. It's really nice because you can make it how you want it. So I don't have a blog. I know there's some people, writers that like to have a blog. I don't have links to specific poems, which also would be a nice thing to have. I just didn't go that route, but you could.
I have a blog, but I haven't, since I started the YouTube thing, I've not really done it very much. And I find that way more people are willing to watch a video of you talking about a subject than they are to read a little blog post article.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I do have a YouTube channel also at the Sonnet Queen. And I do have some of the public recitations that I've done of my poetry and some non-public, but most of them were either at a public venue or an online something or other. So come and listen. It would be really exciting.
Fantastic.
I appreciate it very, very much. It's been really interesting to talk to you about these things, and means a lot.
Well, I'm sure that people who watch this will find your advice instructive.
I hope that anything I've said can be helpful to someone. I hope they enjoy hearing my poems and you can read them too. I really hope you will, because that means more to me than anything.
Thanks so much, Teresa.
Yeah, thank you.